Hello, welcome to the next in the series of syntax lectures. This one's the 7th, and this time we're going to be moving on to look at the structure of noun phrases. Before we get to that bit, let's have a quick recap of what we've covered so far. So far we've been looking at a theory of phrase structure known as X-bar theory, which claims that there's a limited set of positions, different types of positions inside every phrase, and that every phrase has exactly the same structure. It looks like this. In every phrase there is a head, which is a word, and that head determines the category of the whole phrase. So if the head is a verb, then the whole thing is a verb phrase. If the head is a noun, then the whole thing will be a noun phrase. Next to the head is the complement, and that has a relationship with the head such that the head determines what the complement should be, whether or not the complement should be present at all, and what category the complement should be. There's also a further position to the right of the to the left of the head. That's the specifier position. Both the complement and the specifier position are phrasal positions, not head positions. Now, specifically, the kinds of phrases we've been looking at include the determiner phrase, which is headed by a determiner. The determiner always has a noun phrase complement when it has a complement at all. And in its specifier position, we have the possessor of the DP. We've also looked at inflectional phrases headed by inflections. These are basic sentences. The verb phrase sits in the complement position of the inflection. The inflectional head is things like modal auxiliaries, tense, or in the infinitival to. And in the specifier of the inflectional phrase is the subject of the clause. We've also looked at complementizer phrases which are built on top of IPs, taking the IP in the complement position. The head is a complementizer, and these things have to do with the force of the sentence. That is, whether or not they are the sentence is being used to ask a question or make a statement or something like that. Complementizers then are categorized for those sorts of things, like that being a declarative complementizer and if being an interrogative complementizer. In the specifier position of the CP, we have phrases which again are to do with questions, known as WH phrases. These are involved in specific types of questions involved in asking for information type questions. So these are phrases like who, which, what, etc., etc. Okay, so today then we're going to move on and have a look at the phrase which appears inside of the DP, that is the noun phrase, and obviously the noun phrase is headed by a noun. Now, noun phrases come in various shapes and sizes. Like most things, the complement and the specifier positions are optional. You don't have to have them. All you might have is, of course, just the noun inside it. So here's an example, the house. But nouns can have complements. So, for example, here's an example with a prepositional phrase complement of the noun, so the picture of John. Okay, as we can see then, the noun phrase is no different so far from anything else at all. And what we're going to do today then is look at more specific details about the way the noun phrase functions and what kinds of possibilities you can get within the noun phrase. Before we move on to the details, it's worthwhile making a contrast between the kinds of things that we've looked at so far, which have had the kinds of phrases which have functional heads like determiners, inflections, and complementizers, and compare those to the kinds of other heads which are known as thematic heads, which verbs and nouns and adjectives are examples. These things tend to have very different properties. They are different kinds of words, and that does affect the kinds of things that we find in their phrases. So, for example, while a functional head doesn't have descriptive content, that means the kind of content that you can look at the meaning of a word and think, yes, I know what that is describing, what part of the world or the universe or something like that this is describing. Functional heads just don't have that kind of meanings, whereas thematic heads do. So, for example, if we take words like the, may, and if as examples of determiners, inflections, and complementizers, as you can see, these kinds of words don't have that sort of meaning which you can identify something or some aspect of the universe which they're referring to. Contrast that with verbs like think, dog, and tall. Well, again, it's fairly easy to identify what the meanings of these things are because they refer to certain aspects and certain properties of the universe, and you could point to things as being a dog or something being tall or someone who is thinking. Another difference that we find is that thematic heads tend to be predicates. That is, they are words which relate other words to each other. These other words are the arguments that those predicates take. Whereas functional heads are not predicates. They don't relate elements of a sentence to each other. They just add a specific meaning to the meaning provided by mainly their complements, like the verb phrase with the inflection or the noun phrase with the determiner, etc. So, for example, if we take some thematic heads like verbs and nouns and adjectives, you can see that they relate these elements in these sentences to each other. John loves Mary is a relationship between John and Mary, such that John is the one doing the loving and Mary is the one getting loved. Sue is a student of linguistics. Again, the word student here is relating Sue and linguistics. Sue is the one who is the student, and what she is the student of is linguistics. Similarly, Bill is fond of chocolate. Fond is something relating Bill to chocolate, as much as Bill is the one who is fond of it, and chocolate is what he is fond of. So this aspect of meaning is something peculiar to thematic heads and not to functional heads. And to a large extent, this is one of the main reasons why there is a syntactic difference between the kinds of functional heads that we've been looking at and the thematic heads, which we're about to look. Another aspect of the differences between these things, again, is related to that, and that is that the thematic heads have lexically determined complements. That means that the complements that a thematic head has depends on which particular head you're looking at. And that, again, is precisely because of the way it behaves as having descriptive content and being a predicate relating certain things. They basically have a richer lexical content in that respect, and that is shown by the kinds of complements that these words tend to take. So certain verbs may have DP complements, they may have objects, or they may have prepositional phrase complements. Functional heads, on the other hand, have very fixed complements. As we've seen, determiners have NP complements, inflections have VP complements, complementizers have IP complements, and that never differs from one determiner or inflection or complementizer to another. So, for example, then, love is the kind of verb that has a DP complement. It's a transitive verb, and that DP is its object. Hope, on the other hand, is a prepositional verb, taking a prepositional phrase complement. And think is the kind of verb that has a clause as its complement. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to nouns and see what kinds of things we find with nouns. Like verbs, different nouns have different types of complements. One common type of complement that we find with a noun is a prepositional phrase. So, for example, the noun picture takes a prepositional phrase of John to be its complement. Other nouns take different types of prepositional phrases as their complements. And again, this is to do with their lexical content. You couldn't really have a prepositional phrase headed by the preposition to along with the noun picture. Picture to London doesn't make much sense. And signpost of John wouldn't particularly work. That's because picture is the kind of noun that has the kind of prepositional phrase complement headed by of, where signpost has the kind of prepositional phrase as its complement headed by to. Others take other types of prepositional phrase. Question, for example, can take a prepositional phrase with about as its head, so a question about the law. Note, you could have, say, a question of consciousness or something like that. So some nouns take more than one type of prepositional phrase complement, but again, that's a lexical matter. That's a fact about the noun question. Dispute with over, to dispute over something, or to dispute about something, perhaps. Attitude towards, again, it's specifically to do with those particular nouns. Now, besides having prepositional phrase complements, we can also find nouns that have sentence complements, that is CPs. The fact that John is rich, fact, is the kind of noun that has a complementizer phrase as its complement. This instance, we've got essentially a finite complement, but there are nouns that have non-finite complement, non-finite clausal complements. So, for example, request can take a non-finite for Peter to return as its complement. Suspiciously absent from this list, however, is a noun that has a DP complement. DP is a fairly common complement for verbs, for example. So you can find transitive verbs with objects which are DP complements, but you simply don't seem to find nouns with DP complements. So, I mean, the centre, the city, is ungrammatical. Now, it turns out that this isn't just an accident. It turns out that it's a fact about nouns that they just simply cannot have DP complements. And we can show that by the fact that there's a phenomena where we can take a verb and turn it into a noun by adding a morpheme to it. This is known as nominalization. For example, take the verb react. We can add a morpheme shun to the end of that, and it turns into a noun reaction. This is a morphologically sort of complex process because sometimes it's not entirely obvious what the morpheme is. So, for example, if we took a verb like believe and we add some nominalizing morpheme to it, we get the noun belief. And there it's not clear exactly what the morphological process is going on there, but for our purposes, what's important is that we've got a form there, belief, which is the nominal form of the verb to believe. Clearly those are two words of different categories, but are obviously related to each other. Now, what's important for us is that when you take a verb, add a nominalizing morpheme to it, what you form is a noun that can take the same kind of complement that the verb could take. So, for example, take the verb to react. React is actually a prepositional phrase, a prepositional verb, which can take a prepositional phrase complement. So you can say react to the medicine. Exactly the same is true of the noun reaction. Okay, so the noun reaction can take a prepositional phrase complement, as in the reaction to the medicine. Believe, on the other hand, is the kind of verb that can take a clausal complement, and belief is the kind of noun that can take a clausal complement. So what we can see is that when you take a verb and you turn it into a noun, the new noun that you form by adding this nominalizing morpheme to it takes on the same kind of lexical properties that the original verb had. That is, if the verb is specified for being able to take a certain complement, then the noun that you form from it will also take that complement. However, if we try to do that with a verb that takes a DP complement, i.e. a transitive verb with an object, take for example compose, as in to compose a symphony, and you turn that into a noun, you can't have composition of symphony. The composition of symphony is just plainly ungrammatical. So despite the fact that this noun composition is formed from a verb by a nominalizing process, it can't somehow take on that verb's lexical property of being transitive and have an object, a DP complement. So it just seems then that nouns in general, as a general thing of the category, they're just incapable of taking DP complements for some reason or other. Now, we're not going to try to account for this fact in these lectures. That's something for a more advanced lecture, but we'll just note it for the time being, and we'll just accept nouns just simply do not have DP complements. However, what seems to happen, and this would suggest that what's going on with nouns is something perhaps a little bit more complicated, is that you can kind of salvage the situation where a noun seems to want to have a DP complement. So, for example, let's take our composition noun again, formed from compose, which is a transitive verb, and so we might expect we should have a transitive noun, but obviously we can't because nouns can't take DP complements. But what we can have in such a case, instead of the composition a symphony, is the composition of a symphony. And that of seems basically to perform very little in terms of the semantic content of this situation here. The of is, as it were, inserted into this construction in order to allow the noun to take a DP complement. Essentially what it does is it gives the noun a prepositional phrase complement where the prepositional head plays absolutely no semantic role. It's one of these pleonastic elements, a bit like the it subject of sentences like it seems that John is tall, or something like that, or the do that you get inserted into sentences where the inflection can't appear on the verb. Okay, it seems as though these are elements which are inserted into a structure in order to salvage those structures from going wrong by violating some principle, like, for example, clauses must have subjects, and if there's no semantic subject, then you have to give it a meaningless subject. Or inflections have to attach to verbs, and if the inflection can't attach to the main verb, well, then you have to invent an auxiliary verb to attach to. This is what seems to be going on here with this of. Nouns can't take DP complements, but if you've got a noun that wants a DP complement, you can salvage it by inserting this of. Now, technically, what that would seem to suggest is that nouns can have DP complements at D structure. That is, remember the structure at D structure is the structure you get at the beginning of the derivation, before anything moves or before any syntactic processes of insertion, for example, take place. So at D structure, a noun like composition would have a DP complement. It's just that at S structure it can't have the DP complement, and so therefore of has to be inserted by S structure. So whatever the condition on nouns that prevents them from having complements is, it's a condition on S structure, not a condition on D structure. Okay, let's move on and consider another aspect of the structure of noun phrases. And this time we'll look at the modification of nouns and noun phrases. Specifically, we'll start by looking at adjectival phrase modification of nouns. Okay, well, one thing we know about adjectives is that they can be part of a DP. They come in between the determiner and the noun phrase, and what's more, you can have more than one of them. So here we've got a tall student, tall modifying student here, or you can have a tall ginger-haired student, or a serious tall ginger-haired student, and you can keep on adding these adjectival phrase modifiers to expand the whole DP. What this suggests then, and something that we've covered in the previous lectures last semester, is that this indicates that these kinds of modifiers have an adjunct status. And an adjunct is something which attaches itself to the thing that it is joined to and forms another one of those things. So, for example, this AP tall attaches to the noun phrase and forms another noun phrase with it. So what we have here is an AP adjoined to a noun phrase that it modifies. And given that we've got an NP there, and the NP can be broken up into an AP and an NP, we can keep on doing this as many times as we like. So here we can just keep on stacking up these adjuncts and have a tall ginger student, or a tall serious ginger student, etc., etc. Okay. Now note, you can't put the adjectival phrase on the right-hand side of the noun. So whenever an adjectival phrase is a modifier, it always modifies to the left. So AP modifiers are left adjoined to NPs. Now that's important because adjuncts in general can come either side of the element that they're attached to. Okay, so for example, an adverbial modifier of a verb phrase can either precede it or follow it. Nouns, on the other hand, seem to be restricted in terms of which side their modifiers have to be on, and adjectival phrases have to be on the left-hand side of the noun that they modify. However, this is slightly more complicated than at first seems. Take something like a more complicated adjective like knowledgeable. Okay, so it's perfectly good to have a knowledgeable student where knowledgeable is on the left-hand side, but that AP could be expanded, and we could give the adjective knowledgeable a complement of its own. So say, for example, knowledgeable of his subject. But note, when you've got this, you can't have that AP on the left-hand side of the noun that is modifying. So a knowledgeable of his subject student doesn't work. On the other, instead, what has to happen here is that the AP has to be on the other side of the noun. Okay, and we get a student knowledgeable of his subject. So what it seems then is that AP modifiers are left adjoined to the NP, except if the adjective has a complement of its own. Then it has to be right adjoined to the NP. Okay, so again we see this optional behavior of adjuncts, that they can come to the left or to the right of the thing that they are modifying. It's just that it depends essentially on the facts of the modifier. If the adjectival phrase modifier is just an adjective, then it always comes to the left. if it's an adjective plus its complement, then it has to come to the right. Nouns can also be modified by prepositional phrases. So, for example, let's take our case of a student, and we can modify it by adding a preposition phrase, a student in the class. So, in the class here is a prepositional phrase modifying that noun phrase student. And again, just like other modifiers, this is something which you can keep on adding because it's an adjunct and therefore is in a recursive relationship to the thing that it's modifying. And we can have more than one prepositional phrase therefore, so a student in the class with long hair. The kind of structure that that produces is entirely equivalent to the one we've just seen. The prepositional phrases are adjoined to the noun phrase, which means there's a noun phrase above them and a noun phrase as their sister. Okay, and given that you can have that kind of structure, you can keep on having that and keep on adding the prepositional phrase modifiers. Note, however, that the prepositional phrase, unlike the adjectival phrase modifier, always follows the noun. Okay. Again, however, this is perhaps not so straightforward as appears to be the case. And that's because sometimes we can find prepositional phrases that themselves are just consist of just prepositions. So, for example, take the cheese was off, meaning the cheese was bad, had gone off or something like that. Okay, so we can use off here as a prepositional phrase without a complement of its own. And when you use such prepositional phrases to modify nouns, they don't appear after the noun. So you can't say the cheese off. What you have to say is the off cheese. Similar with the fashion was in, where in is a preposition phrase here consisting of just the preposition. You don't say the fashion in, but the in fashion. So what it seems like then is that prepositional phrase modifiers are basically adjoined to the right of the noun phrase, except when the preposition doesn't have a complement. So this seems to be the opposite of the adjectival phrase. Well, actually, it's not exactly the opposite. It's virtually the same, because what we're seeing is that modifiers that have complements always follow the noun phrase that they modify, and modifiers without a complement always precede, no matter what whether they are prepositional phrase modifiers or adjectival phrase modifiers. The difference between the two is simply that more adjectives can appear without complements than prepositions. Prepositions typically have their own complement, and therefore typically the prepositional phrase modifier appears to the right. Adjectives can have their own complements, but most of them don't tend to have complements, and therefore they mostly appear to the left. Okay, that's the end of what we want to say today. Let's just quickly summarize what we've said. Nouns obviously are the heads of noun phrases, and the noun phrase always appears in the complement position of a determiner. You never get a noun phrase outside of a DP, they always appear in that position. Nouns themselves can take complements, and obviously, just like every other head, the complement appears to the right. Typical kinds of complements to find of nouns are prepositional phrases and clauses, and the notable fact about nouns is that they can never have DP complements. They can be modified by adjectival phrases and prepositional phrases, and these phrases are adjoined to the NPs which are being modified. These modifiers will appear to the right if they have no complements of their own, and they will appear to the left if they do have complements. Okay, that's it for this week. Next time we'll be looking a little bit more further at the kinds of modification of noun phrases, but this time we'll be looking at the clauses that can be used as modifiers, and the special kinds of things that we find in those clauses. I'll see you then. Bye bye.